What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. So we've got Star Wars Outlaws here, and I've been playing and testing this game for about a week up until embargo here of being able to release this video and show some performance for all the different handhelds I've been playing this game on. I've got about 16 hours in the game, and all of this has been played across the different various handhelds here. So we're going to check out a lot of different performance throughout the video. I'll definitely timestamp everything for you guys so you can jump around, but you might want to stick around for some of the beginning parts and everything, as there's a lot of info to get into. Now, the bad news here is for the Steam Deck. Unfortunately, when it comes to SteamOS, myself and anyone else I've been working with trying to make this work properly can get it to launch and run just fine with the Ubisoft launcher, but can't get any kind of controller support to work no matter what, which is certainly an odd one when it comes to the deck. The keyboard will work fine. I could dock a mouse and keyboard, but a Bluetooth or wired controller wouldn't work, and also the controller on the deck, just no matter what, wouldn't work here, which for handheld gameplay certainly going to be a serious issue. But honestly, it might not be that big of a deal or that big of a loss as we get into it, because when I would launch into a game here, I would always crash out and freeze the deck anyway and have to restart, which was really a bummer there. And when it came to running on Windows, just to see how this game would work, because I figured Handheld Companion, it would show up for the controller, and it does, and it works just fine here, and I can use the controls and get into a game. But as I suspected from Z1 Extreme Performance, which you'll see in this video, I didn't expect the Steam Deck, even at 800p with FSR and all those things, to be able to really run this game very well. This game is very difficult to run, and it is pretty low FPS even on the more powerful devices at 25 watts. So I was expecting this to be rough, and it was, and the frame rate can be pretty low. So even though this is Windows and not SteamOS, I still have a hunch, even if we were able to get this to work properly on SteamOS, and we'll continue to try, and it may get updates and may be fixed even at the time of you watching this video, and maybe controller support's now working, but it wasn't for the whole time of me testing out this game. But yeah, I don't think we would see performance get a lot better, and you'll see why I think that when we get into the Z1 Extreme stuff with the Go and the Ally devices and that type of thing. But yeah, unfortunately, that's going to be the way it is, though, for the deck when it comes to Star Wars Outlaws. But when it comes to the Legion Go and the Ally X and the OG Ally as well, you actually can play the game, but again, performance is tough. So let's get into it. We're going to start with the settings for these devices. So I'm only going to show these once, because I'm pretty much just going to be using these same settings throughout the rest of the video for the Legion Go, the Ally X, and a little bit of the Ally when we get to the end. When it comes to video, we're going to start at 800p here, but we'll be doing 1200p as well, and on the Allies, 720p and 1080p. We'll be using FSR 3 in this video at balanced almost all the time, unless I show you some different stuff here in the beginning of the video that we're going to look at, like quality here for a moment when we get into the beginning. And then when it comes to graphics, I'm mostly going to be sticking to the low preset, because again, this game is already pretty hefty and hard to run with all the motion blur stuff turned off. I will show some medium though, and some frame gen, because I really think frame gen is going to be the only real way to enjoy this game on any of the handhelds. You have a whole slew of settings that you can go through and really be able to tweak the game, though, even though I'm using these presets, but there's not really any headroom when it comes to being able to run these games any better than I already am at the higher 25 watts and the 6 gigs of VRAM and all that kind of stuff. But anyways, let's go ahead and get into it and start checking out performance here, starting with the Legion Go. And like I said, I did go with 6 gigs of VRAM on here because I did test 4. It did give me more issues. However, this does short the system RAM a bit and cause some stutter in the game that I don't get on the Ally X, but we'll look at that more and talk about that more as we get into it. The first thing I want to do here isn't just applying to the Legion Go. This applies to the Ally X and the Ally and all that. I'm going to show some of the different settings here besides low and FSR. If I go into medium, we go from 31 to 27, 28, and we're just standing still here. We're not actually out doing anything. And if we go to high, we immediately will come down to about 24. If we were out doing real world gameplay, medium and high with no frame gen or anything on become really unplayable even at 800p. If we stick with low, though, we're able to pull it off without going through and tweaking any other settings, just kind of using the preset there and turning off the motion blur stuff. Ultra quality versus quality on the FSR, you're going to gain 1 or 2 FPS each time you step this up. We go up to balanced, which is what I'm going to focus on and use in the video. I like balanced on the FSR. It is what it is. It helps performance enough. If we go to performance or higher, though, the gains kind of minimalize a little bit in here. We don't get as much, and of course your picture quality is going to take a bigger hit. So balance is just kind of where I stuck, and we're going to do that for the Ally and the Go and everything here with that. Mostly low FSR3 balanced, and then the VRAM settings 25 watts, and we'll use some frame gen on and off. Now with the Legion Go here running around with these settings, it is going to be similar to something like I experienced in Starfield. You get some pretty low FPS with some hiccups and stutters and things in the cities and towns and that type of stuff, which from what I can tell, I'm really attributing to the amount of system RAM we have at 16 gigs shared, because this device and the original Ally with 16 gigs do a lot of the freeze ups and stutters and frame drops and issues, both of them that the Ally X never really did to me at all in all of my hours of testing. So that is a big difference there that I've spotted with this game being really RAM hungry, and the two devices with the Go and the Ally struggling much more than the Ally X, which you'll see later on when we get into the Ally X stuff. Now, one place that does run really well is space on all the devices. Here on the Legion Go 800p, space is one of the easier places to run. It's pretty clean, frame times stay pretty good, and you'll get a higher FPS. I didn't spend a lot of time on space stuff when it came to the footage for this video, just because everywhere I went and did some space battling or treasure hunting, it was decent, good FPS. Definitely better than anything on any of the planets or moons or missions that I experienced there. And going across the road in your speeder and stuff, you're certainly going to run into some hiccups and major frame drops, and be in the 20s most of the time with 800p FSR3 balanced here for this. Unfortunately, I'm not saying it isn't playable. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying this is the performance that we're getting here with this game here. It's very tough one to run, and it does appear to be very RAM hungry, and it's just not easy to run on these handhelds, which are lower and lower powered devices. Now, missions that might be inside and that kind of thing, you know, where you're not out in the open world, just like in Starfield, you'll get some better performance, a little higher, better frame times, less hiccups and drops and things like that. So really depends on where you're at in the game, what planet, the environment, inside, outside, how many enemies, NPCs, size of the city, all that kind of stuff's going to affect if you're down to 20 or maybe all the way up into the 40s with these kind of settings. But most of the time, making your way around the terrain and in missions, you're going to be bouncing around in those 20s without any frame gen on, which we're going to take a look at here in a little bit, because I do think frame gen is important here to make this playable. Now, you saw how rough 800p was with the FSR there, so 1200p obviously is going to be even more difficult to run. We get more stutters and hiccups, and I will tell you that 1080p on the Ally X wants like 7 gigs of VRAM, at least allocated. You'll see that later on, so I do believe that a lot of this, again, is contributed by the 16 gigs shared, just really being shorted on the RAM side of things, both the VRAM with this higher resolution and also system RAM, which you'll see later on. But yeah, I think that's kind of what goes on there. 1200p isn't something I would necessarily want to try to use over 800p. 800p is barely playable with no frame gen, and even with frame gen, 1200p is going to be rough. And well, of course, even in space, 1200p is fine. We'll come down in the 30s. I had some areas that were like 31, 32 and some other missions that I did, but ultimately in space everything stays smooth again, easier than running on the land and that type of thing. I thought I'd throw it in there and show it again, but most of my time is spent on the planets, on the moons, doing missions, using my speeder to get across the different areas, and this is the type of experience where 1200p, 19 FPS there, or getting into battle and getting those hiccups or frame drops or freeze ups that will happen in here just really isn't good and isn't worth it. So definitely an 800p game. Now, if we go in and take a look at some frame gen, I think this is probably the way I would recommend playing the game, and I said the same thing about Black Myth Wukong. It works really well in that game, well worth it. It doesn't really hurt the input latency, and it's kind of similar here for Star Wars Outlaws. Now, originally we weren't going to be able to use frame gen in the game, and Ubisoft's still working on it with AMD actually and trying to get everything sorted out. There are still some artifacting issues and some stutters that they've talked to us about, and they do have more updates coming out, be it day one and beyond that, to smooth out the experience. But being able to show it to you here, it's certainly my preferred way to play it at 800p on the Legion Go with frame gen here. It does still have some stutter and some drops and some freeze up times, but it's actually not as bad as without frame gen. These areas that had more stutter in them earlier on in the video and issues actually had a lot less issue for me with frame gen turned on. Less drops and stutter and problems, and overall higher frame rate. Again, they're still there, they still do exist, and I still do think a lot of that is due to the lack of RAM on some of these devices. I do think 16 is short these days when it comes to a lot of these games, especially open world games. But it does overall perform decently, especially when you get into an area and it's all kind of loaded in and you're playing. If it doesn't run into any major issues, it feels just fine here with frame generation on. So I really found that to be super useful here in this game. I honestly don't know how playable the game will be for a lot of people down in the 20s a lot of the time, 30 some of the times, if they're not using frame gen there. And of course, frame gen in space, where we have a much higher base frame rate, it feels great. It's even better when it comes to the input latency and the smoothness of the feel, because obviously the higher your base frame rate, the better off you are, which brings us to 1080p, which you saw earlier in the video has pretty poor performance, anywhere from what, 18, 19 FPS up to 28, 29 FPS without frame gen. And turning it on, yes, it does help, but we still have a lot of stutters and freeze ups and issues, and 1200p is really just a bit much for the system when it comes to this game. You can certainly try it and pull it off in certain areas, but you're gonna run into a lot of places where you have problems, and I just don't see it on the Legion Go screen. Even though it is a big screen, the 800p actually looks pretty good on there, and FSR 3 does a pretty good job, much better than the older versions of FSR. We still have some ghosting and artifacting and things happening with frame gen. You can certainly see it here on the character and in other areas, but yeah, it definitely would need a lot more boost and performance here to work better off at 1200p, but I'm fairly happy with some of the areas of performance when it comes to 800p and frame gen for the Go. Now, some of you would be interested in medium settings at 800p with frame gen on, if there's room to do some of that, and there certainly is, but when you start to introduce the medium settings, it does kind of bring down that base frame rate. It does want more RAM, which we don't have access to here, and it does kind of bring back even more of those like stutters and issues that frame gen helped get rid of on low. They kind of start coming back when you go to medium, and I'm not sure it's really worth the trade-off when it comes to the visuals, but it really just depends on what your preference is going to be. You can see here this is a lot less smooth here than it was when we were on just low here with the frame gen on and FSR 3 balanced and all of that. So I don't know, that's really going to kind of depend on your own personal preference if you really want to push medium, but it really does introduce a lot of issues with stutters and lower frame rates than what I was getting with low. The game is just overall hard to run, and we don't have a lot of extra RAM here to work with when it comes into bringing in even higher end assets or running things on medium. Of course, inside missions and stuff like that is going to run a good bit easier, and medium looks pretty nice, and maybe you want to switch back and forth for some certain areas potentially, but like cities and open world areas and things like that, yeah, medium without frame gen, absolutely not, and with frame gen it's still pretty rough sometimes. Now let's go ahead and move over to the Ally X and look at some 720p and 1080p performance there with and without frame gen, and then we'll take a look at a couple more things once we get through there. So here on the Ally X, performance is actually pretty decent. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about higher frame rates. While at 720p versus the 800p you saw in the Legion Go, it will be a little bit higher because of that. We also just have the additional RAM with 24 gigabytes of overall system RAM, 8 gigs set to VRAM. That leaves me 16 for my system, which is your kind of minimum recommended for running a lot of these games. And a lot of these newer games, from Black Myth Wukong to Star Wars Outlaws, want more overall RAM, more VRAM and more system RAM, and you can see it being used up here in this game. But what didn't happen to me while playing and running around with low FSR 3 here at 720p was any of those stops and stutters and freeze ups that you would see over on the Legion Go. And I tested the OG Ally as well, which we'll take a quick look at later on in the video, and it performs exactly like the Legion Go and has the same stutter issues here and there and stuff that it has. And the only thing I can really attribute that to, again, is the available RAM that the system has to work with. That's the kind of the same thing that they all have in common that I'm able to test here. But yeah, the Ally X was quite surprising. Again, I'm not saying highest frame rate and best playability there, although it is pretty solid. You can see having all the RAM that we want here for VRAM and system RAM, we're just not running into any of those major dips in frame rate or stutters or freeze ups or anything. Even this area right here, which is notorious going in and out of this city for major issues with stutter, it dipped in frame rate, but it didn't stutter. And I've put about 4 hours on the Ally X with this game, and I don't really know that I can necessarily count more than 1 or 2 times that I got those like really bad hangups or really bad stutters. There's some time to time, the frame times will vary here and there, but I mean, ultimately a pretty smooth experience even at a lower frame rate. And of course, we got to take a quick look at space again, even though I didn't cover this a ton in the video because it just performs decent no matter where I was at in the game. I do like to show it, and it is of course the smoothest part of the game, the easiest to run, which is nice because there is a lot of combat and stuff like that. But inside the cities and open world areas and other stuff, we're definitely down in the 20s, just like the 800p over on the Legion Go, except Again, the difference is I just never really ran into any stutter issues or load-in type issues where the game would freeze up or stop for a second with this. And again, the only thing I can attribute to that myself, even though there may be other factors I'm not thinking of or aware of right now, really is the additional RAM that the system has to work with. Now, a lot of games don't take advantage of that, and it can take some work sometimes to find games that do when I compare these systems, but I definitely think, like some other recent games, this one is one that does like having more RAM. Assassin's Creed Mirage is another one that definitely loves having the RAM here on the Ally X. Now, 1080p I didn't expect a lot out of because 1200p is pretty rough on Legion Go, as we saw over there, and I definitely don't recommend 1080p with or without frame gen here on the Ally X either. 720p you can get away with the FSR3 and everything, especially frame gen, which we'll take a look at. But the 1080p is just a little too low for me, and when it comes to frame gen, that base frame rate's going to be low too. But these areas right here that you saw stuttering and stopping on the Legion Go, it never happens here on the Ally X, and I just think that that's interesting and actually pretty important to point out, because I do always say that it's not just about the frame rate you're getting as far as something being playable. It's about the frame times that you're getting and how smooth is that gameplay. It makes a huge difference. Even here, where no one wants to play a game at 19 or 20, 21 FPS, it's horrible, right? But it's solid. It doesn't dip or freeze or stutter or stop, and I'm able to actually aim and play the game here with a gamepad on the Ally X and play at this low frame rate. Why? Because the frame times are solid, and again, I attribute that to the RAM that the system has, because it's overall the same hardware that the OG Ally has, albeit quicker RAM here with more of it, and the Legion Go, which has the same speed RAM but less of it. So very interesting, and of course in the city areas, a lot like open world and stuff, really low performance. It's smooth, but it's very low when it comes to the actual frame rate and being playable. So 1080p can get pretty rough there. But I do want to go over and take a look at frame gen for 720p here on the Ally X, because this is actually a pretty playable experience that I enjoy here. Just like Legion Go 800p with frame gen, that's how I'm playing there. I'm playing 720p with frame gen here on the Ally X, and it's been a really good experience for me so far. Again, it's smooth though, much less stutter. It looks pretty nice, especially on the small screen. We're only talking about a 7-inch screen, so a lot of the artifacting or ghosting or even the 720p being upscaled with FSR3, it's not perfect by any means, but it doesn't look too bad on that 7-inch screen. I could definitely enjoy playing this enough this way. And frame rates, of course, in space are great, and we don't have any problems out there in those kinds of battles. This area, again, notorious for bad frame rate and dips and stutters and freeze ups for me on some of the stuff on the Ally and the Legion Go. Didn't give me any trouble here with frame gen, moving around in between the city and a couple of the first combat areas out here. So yeah, this stayed pretty smooth, really playable. The 800p frame gen on Legion Go was really playable as well. This is just slightly better. We have that additional RAM, it's smoother, we have less hiccups and stutters. It's just an overall pretty good experience, I would call it, on the Ally X. I can't really complain. I mean, I'm able to just zoom around on my speedrun, various different planets and the moon here and stuff, and really not have problems. And of course, trying frame gen on 1080p, much like the 1200p over on the Legion Go. I wouldn't say it's great or playable. It's more playable than the 1200p is over on the Legion Go, and I think that's just due to the fact that we have the smoother frame times. The system has room to breathe and have things loaded in ahead of time and all of that. It is overall a smoother experience when it comes to actual frame times and not dropping and freezing and stuttering like the 1200p will do a lot. But I still wouldn't call it a super great playable experience when I'm comparing it to what I can really get out of it at 720p, or even if you want to push some medium settings at 720p, which we'll take a look at here. But ultimately it will be up to you. I did have some stutters like that would happen at 1080p with frame gen. It's the only time the Ally X would really stutter on me. So yeah, 1080p frame gen just wasn't a great experience over the 720. Now you could go with some medium settings on this as well. Some pretty bad ghosting and artifacting there, especially on the character's head. Again, we're supposed to have some updates out to work on that. But medium settings kind of take back some of the gains that you're really getting out of the low with frame gen on. You're almost down, not quite, but you almost come down to 1080p type performance, and it can get a little bit low. I didn't experience the stutters that I was getting at 1080p with frame gen on, which was good. So you could get away with some medium if you wanted to, but you will lose some of those gains. Again, this is all personal preference stuff. I just want to show you guys how the game's running in general so you can decide how you want to be able to run it. Now, I wasn't going to include anything on the OG Ally yet, though I did test it a lot at 720p, trying to compare it to some of that Legion Go performance and another 16GB model here, even with some slower RAM. And yeah, the OG Ally, no matter where I played it and compared it to the Legion Go, would give me the exact same kind of stutters and problems and issues as I would run around as the Legion Go would give me, that the Ally X pretty much never had happen other than that 1080p frame gen area. So yeah, pretty much tells me that I might be right when it comes to that RAM situation, which isn't rocket science, especially if you've been building PCs for a while and you know the importance of having enough system RAM and VRAM for everything to run smoothly. And even though I didn't get into a big comparison with this video, it's something I could do in the future here for this game, especially because I want the day one patches to come out. But you can see here there's obviously more parity between what's happening with the OG Ally and the Legion Go versus the Ally X there. And even though it's all the same hardware, it's quite a different experience when I'm walking around playing it, and versus no stutters almost ever versus stutters and frame drops and things that will happen even on those lower 800p settings with or without frame gen. Though frame gen does help a ton on the OG Ally and the Legion Go to get rid of a lot of that, so that's been nice to see. But ultimately, I'm really enjoying this game. Besides the performance everywhere, that's going to be up to you if it's running in any way, shape, or form that you want to try to jump in and play the game on any of these devices. I didn't show 900p on the Ally X because its performance is right smack in between 720p and 1080p. You can run it, especially with frame gen. It'll work fine, and you can get away with that. But the video was already pretty long, and we might show that in a future one. And the Legion Go, I think, is running pretty good, definitely 800p in frame gen. And if you're on the OG Ally, 720p in frame gen, unless you're experiencing a lot of troubles, they should work out okay for you there. But again, personal preferences, guys, as to if you're going to jump in on this on the handhelds or not. For me, the Ally X is the better experience overall right now. All right, guys, thanks a lot for coming and check out the video. As always, I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.